Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be discussing the conflict between the ideologies of the USA's capitalism and the USSR's, um, communism or socialism. So, these two nations, I've gotten into the espionage wars post the Second World War, and which, of course, was ensconced in what was called the Cold War. The Cold War. The Cold War literally lasted from about 1945 to 1991 with the collapse of Soviet Russia. Um, and of course, the differences, the conflict was driven by ideological differences, the doctrinaire differences. And the US, as President Truman put it, they were standing for democracy, which was represented in their, version of democracy through capitalism, and of course, against despotism, which he viewed Stalin represented in USSR's communist socialist dogma. Now, the U.S. How did their doctrines come about? So these ideas, these ideology, they're based on some form of they're based on economic systems that each country uh, was ostensibly practicing. I use that word cautiously, ostensibly. So because no country we would find in present day actually, fully practices what uh, their ostensible or their apparent dogma espouse that they practice. So again, capitalism is in the U.S. Comes from it pivots a lot on uh, the classical economists, including Adam Smith, and people who came later on. Today, in modern times, it's taken the form of what's called neoliberalism, as propounded by Chicago professor Milton Friedman and others. So basically, Adam Smith's capitalism talked about the invisible hand, the bizarre invisible hand, and the free market forces, unregulated, by the government, limited government interference, and the private ownership of the means of production, including capital. So basically, that's what the capitalist system was propounding. By the way, I learned a lot of these things not just because of my education. I have an MBA in accounting. I've been a stockbroker with major banks in America. I've worked in management consulting. So not because of what I learned in America, but I actually, before I came to America, I think I had a very excellent education reading when I was a student in history. So I had a degree in history and international studies from a Nigerian university, in University of Jos, and I spent my time in the library. But also we had an excellent curriculum. So the curriculum focused a lot because I specialized in economic history. The curriculum focused a lot on um, studying Marxism, capitalism, a comparison. So I studied U.S. Economical evolution. I studied the Russian economic evolution, European economic revolution, the Marxist thoughts and things like that. I studied the doctrines of the dependency theories, dependentista, that those with new Marxist, new communist philosophers from Latin America. So I had an excellent education in Nigeria before I came to America. So my education is not mainly from America. So I was able to read Karl Marx's books on Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Karl Marx was a brilliant writer. I probably should give sort of their origin story, their backstory. He was a brilliant writer, and it's his ideology, his writings that became the foundation for uh, uh, what later became Marxist-Leninist dogma, which dictated the system of communist Russia, of Soviet USSR, right? Which was involved in this Cold War with the United States capitalist philosophy. Um, so, I've already talked about what, Adam Smith's philosophy about, unregulated, uh, a free market not regulated by the government, where private property, where there's private ownership of property and the means of production, and where there's competition, there's an invisible hand ostensibly guiding, uh, you know, uh, the market forces and the movement of goods and services. Um, However, uh, Karl Marx's Karl Marx propounded something, and by the way, I'm not an apologist for any view, right? Any dogma. I'm not. I'm just a neutral historian, right? And I do analysis. So I'm not propounding for capitalism. I'm not propounding for. I'm not advocating for capitalism or advocating for Marxism in this video that I'm doing. I'm just providing an analysis because I've been discussing the assassination of JFK, and of course his assassination was his assassins were moved by dogma, right? Lee Harvey Oswald had defected from the U.S. and gone to Russia, become communist, and as former CIA director James Woolsey, he believes it was the Soviets who killed him. So I'm trying to give the backstory. As a historian, I always like to go back, and look for the motivation. What was the history? What happened? What's the motivation? Why is it possible? And look at the pros and cons, the arguments that is this possible, or not possible. I don't think the CIA or the U.S. government had JFK assassinated. I don't think the mafia had him assassinated as well. I'm more likely to think if Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone as a lone gunman, as the Warren Commission, uh, you know, propounded. They claim Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Then the more likely thing is that the Soviets, were the masterminds in his assassination, and so that's why I'm giving the ideology that drove the Soviets, that they were in this hateful conflict struggle with the United States for so long. So I'm giving the two opposing doctrines that drove, that motivated the United States and motivated the USSR. It caused a lot of deaths, right, and wasted a lot of resources. Both nations eventually amassed enough nuclear arms to destroy the entire world, right? This is a dread that we live with today. The notion that we actually have, in the nuclear arms proliferation that characterized the Cold War, the nations entered into a state of mutually assured destruction, in which they had amassed enough nuclear arms to destroy the entire world. And so that's why I'm going into the dogma, the history of the history and evolution of the doctrines that divided these two nations. So, Karl Marx. Let me give his background, his origin story. So Karl Marx was a brilliant writer. I've read his works, and he has this. I like writing, so I like people who write well. He has this masterful literary prose that's very it's pithy, it's clear, and it's very evocative. It's able to make succinct, very complex ideas. So Karl Marx was highly educated. He was actually from the bourgeois uh, uh, class that he was writing against. So bourgeois means middle class, right? And I'm going to get into the ideology. Bourgeois basically means middle class, and his father was a lawyer. He'd been a German Jew, and he converted to Lutheranism because of the anti-Semitism in Germany at the time. So he was born into a middle-class family, and he had a great education. He married into another, a family of means. His wife was actually a descendant of, one of the kings of, British royalty. So I'm talking about Karl Marx's wife, and so he got highly educated. He studied law. He got a number of degrees. Studied economics, studied history, philosophy, and he got a PhD from the University of Jena in philosophy. He became a journalist. So he started writing a lot. He spent a lot of time in uh, the library, just studying uh, the histories of various systems. And he was a very original thinker. Is considered, the father of modern socialism. He was able to synthesize thoughts, right, from different things, and he studied Hegelian dialectics, Hegelian philosophy. Dialectics means conflict, right? And he would eventually, that's Karl Marx, he would eventually come up with these theories saying that, that look, his his uh, his theory of history is scientific, and it was economic. Uh, you know, it of course manifests economic determinism, right? And he's saying that the history of, the world, right, is one of class struggle. That's dialectics, and he called it historical material, the dialectics of historical materialism, right? It's based on class struggle, and of course he also said um, that the means of production, right? Society, they've always struggled, and it's been structured around the means of production. And economics, what people will eat, is the most important thing that motivates them, that drives them, right? As opposed to moral philosophy. In fact, he says morality, the legal systems, that's what's called the superstructure. All those things are just, they're just uh, working, they're just frills, right? Frills that are just encapsulating or supporting the foundation, which is the economic determinism, the main, the means of production, what people will eat, what people, materialism. That's the most important thing in society and in the history of the world. And he says that, these things that he's taught, his studying, this theory he's come up with, that it's scientific, and he studies the past. He's saying, look, this thing is scientific. And he spends a lot of time. He was a journalist, and he was getting kicked out from different countries, and he ended up in London, right? And he became really poor because he devoted his entire life to studying in the library and analyzing different things, histories and trends. He went as far back as the Roman Empire. And again, he's talking about the history of the world, that look, it's based on class struggle, right? There's this dialectic, this class struggle, that these uh, classes constantly warring each other, and it evolves, it evolves, it evolves. And he said the highest form of um, class struggle, and the highest class that will be created, are called the bourgeois class, right? The bourgeois classes, and the bourgeois, they would eventually own the means of production. He started as far as, the Roman Empire, where there were the patricians. He talked the early primitive societies where there was there was slavery, and he moves on into the feudal system, where the Roman Empire, there was a conflict between the patricians and the plebeians, the commoners, that were slaves. And then it goes on to the medieval time in Europe, where there, the kings, the monarchies, and the church, and then they're the peasants, right? And so eventually, in his era, the 19th century, after the Industrial Revolution, in the Industrial Age, it's now the bourgeois. The bourgeois class are now the owners of capital, and then they're the proletariat, the working class, or the employees. And he's saying that the bourgeois, they own all the means of production, that they're the most advanced form of this class struggle, right? And they own all the means of production, and that the bourgeois system becomes so brutal, so cruel, because the proletariat, his wage is exploited. He has no property. He doesn't own anything. Everything is owned by the bourgeois class, and all the proletariat, that the laborer, the worker, can do is sell his wage. He can only sell his wage. He can sell his labor for a very little wage, and if he's only living, his standard of living is just barely above subsistence level, right? He can only subsist to go back and work in the factory, and he can't even enjoy, like, he can't enjoy free time. He can't enjoy humanity, the quality of life. He's exploited. And he's saying that there are inherent contradictions in this system, right? And there will be an eventual revolution, that because he's looking at history, right? There was a French Revolution, right? You remember what happened in the French Revolution in the 1789 to 1790s, when they eventually had regicide, and they had a form of classicide, where the peasants revolted and they started beheading the aristocrats. They started killing the aristocrats, and they killed their kings. They committed regicide. How Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, she was killed as well. She was beheaded. And so he's saying that, look, these are inherent contradictions that occur in the class struggle, right? And that we've now reached the stage where the bourgeois, the owners of capital, and the workers are eventually going to now, it's scientific. That was what he was claiming, though, in his analysis and his philosophy, in his dogma, that it's scientific, that, look, things would get to a head, and the masses would just would execute a revolution and overthrow the bourgeois, and eventually they'd come up with this system where they redistribute the wealth that's owned by the bourgeois, and they reach a socialist state, and right, and the proletariat now establish some kind of dictatorship, that the proletariat, the working class, will now rule. They will eliminate private ownership of property, that the state will own the property. Not the state. In fact, it was saying that the creed, the Marxist creed was, or the communist socialist creed was this: to each, that property will be redistributed amongst the people in society, and it will go to it will be from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's the Marxist creed. I remember when I first read that in Nigeria, I had it, I understood it, that's the Marxist creed. It's a communist creed. But again, I'm a student of history. That phrase, that creed, from each according to his ability, to each according to their need, it's the communist creed. A good Christian who knows the Bible well actually knows that's actually a Christian doctrine. It's actually verbatim in the Bible. It's from the book of Acts, right? Acts of the Apostles. You'll find it in chapter 11, verse 29. You'll find it in chapter 4 from 32 to 35, when the disciples, the followers of Christ, after Christ, of course, had died, and the apostles had taken over, and they were now preaching. Those who believed in Jesus now sold all their property. Nobody owned their private property anymore, but they shared their possessions. They all owned it in common, so that they redistributed it. They laid it at the feet of the apostles and redistributed everything from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So that's the first misunderstanding about socialism, right? It's actually a Christian doctrine. The communist Karl Marx adopted it as the communist creed, right? So again, I'm not advocating socialism or capitalism or anything like that, right? I'm not advocating any of these. I'm just again, I'm a historian, observer, just highlighting the conflict that existed during the espionage wars and the Cold War, right? What divided the USA and the USSR. So that was the communist creed that espoused by Karl Marx. It turns out it was actually a Christian doctrine in the book of Acts of the Apostles. It's also in Acts chapter 2. It's in Acts chapter 4 from verses 32 to 35. It's also in Acts chapter 11, verse 29, right? From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So elimination of private property is something that Karl Marx was advocating in any event. And he said this revolution would occur. Now, however, something that happened was in Karl Marx's lifetime, he never, this revolution, this never came about, as much as he tried to advocate it, because he said that there were inherent contradictions in the capitalist system, that it would reach its height, and that these workers, masses of workers, would lead a communist, the socialist revolution or communist revolution to overthrow the bourgeois classes. This never happened. In comes the Russians, right? In Tsarist Russia. By the way, Karl Marx was now banned in several states. It was banned in Germany, banned in Tsarist Russia, and of course he lived in London, died in London, in England. He was supported by his friend, his collaborator, so he died in poverty because he was always living in the library, just writing his works and studying, and but he was supported by a very wealthy friend of his collaborator, Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels was the son of a wealthy German industrialist who was very wealthy, but he was also a socialist. So it's kind of ironic that even though he was a capitalist, right, but he was one of the propounders of socialism and Marxism, right, because they understood the cruel conditions the inhumane conditions of the laborers, right, the working class in their factories, and so he was advocating for some better conditions. Ironically, in America as well, while I was wrongfully detained, I read the biography of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is said to have become the richest man in America at one time, right? He owned U.S. Steel, he owned, and interestingly, Andrew Carnegie didn't have formal education, but he was an autodidact, right? He was born poor. He'd actually worked in one of these factories when he emigrated from Scotland as a kid. He worked as a bobbin boy. Very horrible conditions, working conditions. The laborers would get burned in these steel factories where steel was being made, iron was being made, and sometimes they'd fall into the molten lava. They would be burned alive. these cruel working conditions. So until more recent times, we didn't have the 8-hour work limit, the 5-day a week working days. We didn't have all these benefits that labor now has, society now has. They were under very cruel conditions. So it's ironic that Andrew Carnegie, who had been born poor, grew up poor, and became one of the richest men in America, he hated the conditions himself. We know Andrew Carnegie actually gave away, by the time of his death, 90% of his wealth. 90%. He was one of the richest men in America, self-made, right? They say that. But he hated the mass, the accumulation of wealth. He wrote in his diary that he intended to leave the business of making money by the age of 35. And his dream was to go in school in Oxford. He convinced them to take him, and so he'd be a scholar, and he wanted to be a university professor. That's what he wanted to do. So it's funny that many of these capitalists who become super rich, many of them are actually very brilliant people. Andrew Carnegie was a very brilliant man, even though he didn't have a formal university or schooling education, but he spent his free time in the library. He lived in the library. I saw letters he wrote, because when he was working, he started working very early, in his teens, and he was rising very rapidly because he was always working, and he made a number of connections. It was during the time of the growth of the railroads, expansion of the railroads and the telegraph system. So he was at the right place at the right time, right? And he made tremendous money, made smart investments. He became a stockbroker at one time, a bond salesman, did many different things. But his dream, because he was born poor, he had to work, right? He lived with his mother, by the way, until he was a grown man. He didn't marry until he was in his like 50s or was it 60s or something. He lived with his mother because his mom was very controlling. So he married really late in life. Even though he was super wealthy, he was like the richest man in America. So he wrote that he was going to retire from making money, and he would go and study. So he hated the business of making money, as he put it, because it was like he wanted to be able to have time to read, to develop in other ways. So he would always spend so much time in the library. While he was growing up, him and a group of his friends, they had a reading club. He formed this reading club, young men who were working and they were making money, but they didn't come from wealthy families. So this was something, and he formed the Gilded Age. That's when they made money later on, because they came from they came from a poorer background, right? And so he wanted to improve himself, and he formed this group of like-minded young men who were working, and they didn't come from families with means. They were immigrants and they wanted to improve themselves. He was Scottish, by the way, came from Scotland. And so they would go into libraries and read, spend plenty of time reading, and they would come in their social clubs and they would discuss what they read. You can imagine. So he wasn't just about making money, even though he became a self-made billionaire, one of the richest men in the world. Everybody knows Andrew Carnegie today. There's the Carnegie Mellon University. There's there are all sorts of his endowments. Everywhere. It litters America. In fact, Nigeria, the university I said I went to, I think we got about two. When I was back in Nigeria, we had about, or later on, I mean, we got about $2 million, right, from the Carnegie Foundation. So you can imagine, this was a man. His money went into free public libraries. So he had written. He joined this library in his community in Pennsylvania, and it was free. And because he started making money, I think they were going to make it no longer free. They were going to revoke his free membership. And he wrote, arguing. He was a very brilliant man, even though he didn't have a college education. And he wrote very incisively, very brilliantly about, hey, why, they should give him an opportunity, give, people like him an opportunity to have a free access to a free public library to develop themselves and things like that. So this is part of what the Karl Marx was advocating. He was advocating for free education. That during socialism, when the proletariat take over society, that they would have free education and things like that. Because in the Communist Manifesto, by the way, one of the things he talked about was that the bourgeois classes, right? They were the height of human civilization and development, and they would invest their resources into their children, the education of their children. They had the means, and their children would be amongst the most brilliant in society. That's a fact, right? Right? People who are wealthy, if education is not publicly free to, is not a free public good. Only those who have means would be able to spend money on the development of their children, their progeny, and those who were born poor, those out of their unfortunately born poor. It's not an unfortunate thing to be born, but they wouldn't be able to get access to education. So these are things that Karl Marx analyzed, and he packed into his dogma that separated things. In any event, in comes Karl Marx. Sorry, Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. By the way, when I was wrongfully detained again, I used my time to study, to read, right? And that was one of the things that Karl Marx was saying. He said that in the bourgeois system, when the bourgeois capitalists, control the means of production and the labor of the proletariat, they don't have control of their time, right? That the capitalist controls their time. They can't, they're denied their humanity, right? And so when I was wrongfully detained, right, America, the state of Maryland is carting off young men. I'm much older, but the majority of people locked up in Maryland's jails. I was wrongfully detained, by the way. People who are very young, they're between 18 and they're in their 20s, and wasting their productive years, their most productive years. Fortunately for me, Montgomery County has amongst the most well-stocked libraries, right? So I read extensively, about 100 books while I was wrongfully detained, right? So I made it an education. I wake, because they're feeding you. Maryland is wasting its taxpayer money, right? Just, of course, well, people being detained, they're still human beings and they have rights. They should have access to, they still have access to their fundamental rights. So, but I had the opportunity to read, and I would wake up, I made sure I read 15 hours a day at least. I would wake up and I'm reading, because there's nothing you're doing. You're just locked up somewhere. There's a library, and one of the books I read was the biography of Vladimir Lenin, written by Robert Service. I also read the biography of Stalin, written by a guy called Stephen Kotkin. So they were very well written biographies. I'd read their biographies, of course, in Nigeria because of my degree in history, and just because I'd studied, Russia. I studied Russia in America as well, Colombia, but I'd studied it more extensively and from the philosophy of their socialist ideology, the structure of their environment. And I'll get into it. I want to make this video short, and so I'll get into Lenin later on. But let me start off. So Lenin was another guy. His backstory. He was actually mixed. He was a German Russian, right? He was a German Russian with German roots. He was also mixed with some Asiatic, very minimal, but mostly German. He was Russian. And later on, he never knew, apparently, throughout his life, but it turned out that he also had a Jewish ancestry. One of his grandparents or great-grandparents or something was Jewish, and he converted. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia and in Germany, especially in Russia. So many people would convert. So one of his main collaborators later on, when they was also Trotsky, Leo Trotsky. Leo Trotsky had a PhD, was very brilliant. He was Jewish. It's interesting. So I got to learn. This was something I didn't know when I was studying in Nigeria, but from the biographies I read, it went into detail into the parties, right? The parties. In America, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in America about at the beginning of the 20th century, when they tried to link communism with Jewish people, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism then. So I came to see why. Apparently, prior to the complete Bolshevik revolution, when they purged the other parties that existed, because there are different parties. The first revolution that occurred was the Menshevik revolution, I think of February 1917, and the Bolshevik revolution occurred in October. There were other socialist parties, communist parties, and apparently there was a party, and the Jewish ethnic group was the largest. They had their own party as well that was socialist leading. So they were absorbed later on, right? So I think that's why they had I can't remember the name. I'd have to research to find it. And so they had this party, and they were the largest members of that party. So there were many different socialist parties. And the Bolshevik Revolution, later on, when they took power, they were engaged in this white revolution, red white revolution. And so that's a reason why there's this anti-Semitic linking of communism with Jewish people. So in any event, Vladimir Lenin, his name was not Lenin, was his pen name. It was another brilliant writer. He was a lawyer. He was in Siberia. He had been imprisoned because he was very brilliant. He was an extremely brilliant person. He was like top of the, not just top of the class, but top in like in state exams and things like that. So he was an original thinker. His brother had been part of an attempt to assassinate the Tsar. The Tsar was what was called the Emperor of Russia, and so he was executed because of it. And so they always watched um, uh, Lenin, and Lenin would join a lot of extremist radical groups. There were anarchists. So in Tsarist Russia at that time, there were many different groups, extremist groups trying to assassinate the king, the Tsar. I can call, he's called the Tsar, Russian Tsar. By the way, Tsar is actually a corruption of Caesar, right? Remember, Caesar was the title of the Emperor of Rome, which, came from Julius Caesar's name. And so emperors in Europe would later use Caesar's name as their moniker, their title. The Kaiser in Germany, that's also from Caesar, from the German adulteration, and Tsar is the Russian adulteration of the word Caesar. So in any event, Lenin was very brilliant, and he started to join these revolutionary parties. Now, during that time, there were many different extremist groups. There were the anarchists. There were many different groups, but Karl Marx's doctrine took hold, right? Karl Marx's doctrine took hold. Now, Lenin would merge his own ideas. He was another brilliant thinker, a very original thinker. He adapted Karl Marx's thinking and made it practical, and he applied it to Russia. Karl Marx, part of his philosophy was the end of national governments, because he thought national governments were not exact countries as we know them, were not exactly the thing, right? They evolved over time, right? These geographic entities called states, they evolved over time. But he was saying, that's Karl Marx, he was saying that they were just tools amongst the tools of control of the capitalists or those in power, right, in this continuous dialectic struggle, right, historical dialectics of historical materialism, as he called it. And so he felt that when the time was ripe, that was what he thought would happen scientifically, that the proletariat there will be worldwide international revolution where the working class of all over the world would be in power, and there wouldn't be governments, right? And he was advocating this utopian state, right, where everybody will be equal, and there will be this statelessness and things like that, right? Because he thought the state was just another mechanism of control. And Lenin would take it further, and he would say that, look, imperialism was the height of the bourgeois class struggle, and so they were going to advocate for international revolution all over the world. So you can see where America became cautious, because when they had effected the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and they'd committed regicide, killed the Romanov monarchs, right? The Romanovs were the ruling family of Russia. Well, by the way, the Romanovs were related to Queen Victoria too. So you see the Russian Tsar and his cousin, I think was it King George at the time, the King of England, and the Kaiser William, the King of Germany. They were all cousins, three of them. They all look like spitting images of each other, of one another, right? So they all looked alike. So the Bolsheviks had the Romanovs executed. Of course, that's jarring and alarming for American capitalists, for Americans in general. And there was this crisis in in Russia at the time. And of course, they were warring. And so the notion of what Lenin was, his adaptation of Karl Marx's philosophy. He was advocating international revolution the brotherhood of all working class all over. And he now advocated. Now there was a departure from Karl Marx's philosophy. Karl Marx said, look, his philosophy was scientific, and that proletarian revolution would not come about until the working class, like the society was fully capitalist, right? And it was the bourgeois and then the working class, not the peasants. The peasants was a lower, where there was a peasant class, that was still a feudal society that was still backward. It was still more primitive relative to the capitalist industrialized nation. That he thought that the proletarian revolution would come about in an industrialized society. Russia was not industrialized. Majority of Russia was made up of former serfs, right? Serfs, that was a name for a slave in Russia, right? So majority were serfs, and the serfdom had been banned in the 19th century in Russia, and so majority of them were poor peasants. Lenin took this leap. He said, look, he said they didn't need they didn't need the majority of the people to be factory workers, to be proletariat, yes, that there could be a revolution using the peasants, right? And where Karl Marx had advocated that it was the proletariat that would lead, Lenin created this concept of the vanguard, of the intelligentsia, the bourgeois intelligentsia. Of course, the intelligentsia often came from the bourgeois class, right? It's the middle class, at least, who had the means to spend money on their children, who could read, because you need to have enjoy a certain standard of living before you can go to school. You don't have to keep working. Poor people who have to think about what to eat, right? They don't have time to go to school and educate their minds, or and things like that. The bourgeois were the ones who could do this for their children, for their families, and because they enjoyed a certain standard of living, and they could develop themselves. So in the beginning, historically, the educated class came from the wealthy, right? Plato was the great philosopher, Greek philosopher, right? Ancient Greek philosopher. He was the son of wealthy parents. Aristotle, all these people, right? They were kids of wealthy people. Into the 19th century, this was what it was. It was children of at least the middle class who could get an education, a solid education. Even Lenin himself, Lenin's father had achieved lower gentry. He was a lower Russian gentry, right? He had achieved the status of lower, so it was a lower form of aristocratic family. Karl Marx as well, he was born into a middle class. His collaborator, Friedrich Engels, came from a wealthy family. So that was how it was back then, right? And so this was what Lenin was now advocating. He said that let the leaders of those who lead the dictatorship of the proletarian, they should have a vanguard of the intelligentsia, right? They're bourgeois, because the peasants didn't have an education. There'll be chaos. That's the other thing. There'll be chaos where there's a revolution. You see what happened with the French Revolution, right? When the peasants revolted, the masses, there was chaos, there was disorder. But they need so what Lenin was now advocating, that they need an intelligentsia who understands society, who's highly educated, and they could but they don't have bourgeois leanings, right? They understand things, and that's what Marx also advocated. They have to give up their bourgeois leanings. Part of bourgeois leanings is that, look, the capitalist society wants to make profit. They want to accumulate profit, amass profit. They're selfish and things like that. That's what part of what they were calling bourgeois leanings. By the way, Karl Marx and Lenin, they would go and demonize a certain class. So there was classicide going on. They would demonize the bourgeois class. They'd give them all these terrible attributes and things like that. And so Lenin was saying they need to get rid of these, eradicate the bourgeois leanings, so they could successfully guide the dictatorship of the proletariat on behalf of the proletarian class, right? This video has gotten long, and I'll continue with what was going on in the USSR. I've reached the point where Lenin's ideology, which controlled the Soviet Union, developed. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations that I've been suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland. On May 16, 2023, I was raided and swatted. A swatting is where a false emergency or crisis call is made to generate a large armed law enforcement presence in at the victim's residence. I was almost killed by Montgomery County Police. I was shot in the head, tasered. The objective of the swatting was actually to obstruct justice. I was, as of that time, an auditor in the Department of the Navy, and I had filed complaints regarding fraud and discrimination. Those are my legitimate rights. We're supposed to litigate this in court, but there was an abusive process to obstruct justice, and Montgomery County law enforcement and their criminal justice system was used. I've never been involved in the criminal justice system until that time. So I was wrongfully jailed. I was framed. They staged a false crisis and false things that never happened. I've been defamed, and they used a man, a fabulous called Jide Wari. He's a Howard University professor of finance who falsified an emergency petition. He's subsequently told me and my pastor that he was suborned by Montgomery County Police, and that they said I was in a fight. I was not in any fight. So they manufactured these things to get me swatted, injured, and I was locked up wrongfully for about 9 months without a trial. I haven't had a trial till today. I'm doing these videos because I've been prevented from working by Judge James Bonifant. I was offered a new job at the Pentagon in October 2023. The judge had me under house arrest, right? He locked me up in jail for 9 months, wrongfully committed me to undergo a competency evaluation when I have no mental illness, no history of mental illness. I don't use medication for mental illness. The state psychiatrist have said I don't have a mental illness, but this judge was committing fraud on the court, Judge James Bonifant. He's probably been bribed to violate my rights on behalf of the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, and Aon management where I was leaving, because my rights of usufruct were violated. My usufructuary rights to enjoy, my apartment. I lived alone. It was in my name, but I was ambushed, raided, locked in my home, falsely imprisoned, shot, tasered, almost killed by Montgomery County Police, dehumanized, removed naked, dumped in a hospital. They got the police falsified the incident report. They got a neighbor to falsify a peace order. It's astonishing, right? And I'll continue, with this video later on, because what has happened is what happens in a banana republic, in what we expect Stalinist Russia would be doing, right? Not what would be happening in America. The abuse of state power, and basically a police state where they trump up charges, frame citizens. In any event, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.